Hello and welcome back to another update. It is your host Weeb Union and we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out here in the direction of Turny, where the Ukrainians have launched a counterattack to the east of the village, pushing the Russians away from it and creating a buffer zone between the Ukrainian positions and the Russians, as is confirmed with this geolocated footage resulting from a Ukrainian armored assault on Russian positions to push them back. The Ukrainians with this have now created a buffer zone, securing the village from the Russian positions nearby and clearing out direct fire towards it. Moving further south, we see here in the direction of the west of Bakhmut, the Ukrainians also launched counterattacks here, trying to negate the recent Russian gains by pushing them away from the forest area and the forest lines where the Russians have established positions on the eastern outskirts of Casualty. There are recorded Russian FPV strikes within the forest area hitting Ukrainian positions, mainly infantry with the FPV drones. And with this we see that there is constant efforts by the Russians to improve their positions here in the forest area and push the Ukrainians back to capture the eastern parts of Casualty. However, it is unlikely that the Russians will have much success in the direction of Casualty until that they've secured the northern and southern flanks to allow them to concentrate their forces in one specific direction. And as long as the Ukrainians keep sending reinforcements to launch these counterattacks, it will be difficult for the Russians to push through them. This is why the Russians are heavily focusing on bombarding Casualty with their air force, drones, and artillery to prevent the Ukrainians from gathering and concentrating a lot of troops in the city, which would prevent them from launching further counterattacks towards the Russian positions. Moving on to the next section of the front line, we see here to the west of Avdiivka, there's been this small Russian advance by the Russians here to the north of Berdishi, as is confirmed with this geolocated footage. This allows the Russians to now completely secure the eastern parts of Berdishi, and the fighting will likely move across the river line to the western parts and towards the northern parts, where the Russians will look to gain control over the forest lines and fortifications of the Ukrainians to secure the roads to the north of the village. This will allow the Russians to consolidate their gains in the central parts of Berdishi and start threatening the Ukrainian positions in the north by Novomykhailivka. The Ukrainians, as is seen here with the recent counterattack, are gathering their forces and concentrating them in the north of Berdishi to continuously pressure the Russian positions and launch counterattacks towards them. We see that the Ukrainians are losing armored vehicles and their forces before they actually launch these counterattacks, but once they actually reach the front line, they tend to be effective, and that is why the Russians are heavily relying on their air force and superior firepower to hit those before they actually reach the front line. Moving further south here in the direction of Turny and Novomykhailivka to the west of Avdiivka, we have these two separate geolocated footages which show and confirm some of the recent Russian advances in the end of last month. And with this we see that the reports received are indeed correct and accurate, and this is why we have to make sure we use reliable sources so that we can get the information ahead of time and then later confirm it to make sure that we are reporting on the truth. Moving further south, we see here to the south of Casualty, the Ukrainians have managed to successfully push the Russians out of the southern outskirts of the city. With this, the Russians have no foothold within the city of Casualty, and they are now focusing on pushing through the eastern parts by the railways, through the Ukrainian fortifications, and do some positional fighting there to threaten the Ukrainian positions and improve their own by constantly launching these small-scale assaults and heavy bombardments on the Ukrainian positions. Casualty is suffering from heavy attacks by the Russian artillery and air force, heavily bombarding all of the fortified positions and the buildings used as bases within the city, allowing the Russians to improve their position even if they do not have a foothold within the city. But with this, the Ukrainians will be able to redirect their forces to other sections of the front, which may need them more. In the next section of the front line to the southwest of Donetsk, we see here in the direction of Novomykhailivka two separate Russian advances, one in the northern Dacha area, where the Russians now have control over 50% of the Dacha area, and in the central parts of Novomykhailivka, where the Russians now have started fighting in the western parts of the city. So with this, we see that the Russians are pushing through in the western direction, both in the northern and central parts. This is followed by the Russian capture of the heights here to the south of the town and the fortifications there, leaving only the heights in the north as a threat to the Russian positions within the town. This allowed the Russians to now concentrate their forces in the northern parts and central parts to then push further westwards, where we see both of these geolocated footages confirming both of these advances. The Russians will likely look to capture the final parts of the Dacia area, which will secure the heights to the north, before finally pushing through and completely pushing the Ukrainians out of the town, which would allow the Russians to gain full control of it. This would allow the Russians to then start pushing towards Novomykhailivka. Capturing that as well would mean that the front line would align with the road here to the east of Konstantinivka, and the Russians will likely continue pushing in these fields to improve their positions before starting the Battle of Konstantinivka here to the west of Novomykhailivka. The final section of the front line, which is in the direction of the Zaporizhia front nearby Robotyne, the Russians have launched attacks towards the Ukrainian fortifications in the northeastern outskirts of the Ukrainian summer offensive gains. And with this, the Russians, by pushing towards these and storming these fortifications, will then lead to the capture of them, which will allow the Russians to flank the Ukrainian fortifications in the south, allowing the Russians to attack from 3 separate directions and imply heavy pressure on these positions to then push along the central parts of the fortifications in the direction of Robotyne and flanking it from that direction. After numerous weeks of fighting here within Robotyne, gaining footholds multiple times and now holding it for many weeks, the Ukrainians have shown that they are willing to continue sending reinforcements to the section of the front line to hold the village and prevent a Russian capture of it. This had allowed Russians to heavily bombard the Ukrainian positions in the northern parts, which are largely destroyed. The mistake the Russians are making is by holding a foothold within the village, which puts themselves in a vulnerable position, but it is likely that they're doing this to allow or force the Ukrainians to send reinforcements to prevent the Russians from fully recapturing the village. The village has extreme PR value for the Ukrainians, as it is the only village they have captured to the south of Avdiivka in the direction of Tokmak. Therefore, if the Russians recapture it, they can announce that all of the gains of the Ukrainian counteroffensive in the summer were ended up in a failure, despite the majority of the village not being in Russian hands, and that is because the main push of the Ukrainians was towards the Sea of Azov here to the south, and the Ukrainians failed to break through even a single line of defense. They managed to infiltrate and cross over the initial parts of the Surovikin line to the northwest of Lvova, even reaching the village. However, they have now completely lost their access across, and the Russians are now pushing towards the Ukrainian fortifications to the northeast of Robotyne to then negate the rest of the Ukrainian gains over the summer. According to the recent reports by the Ukrainian side on the bombardments of Russian airfields, despite showing evidence in one of my previous videos that it didn't happen, some kept commenting that, well, what about the news that they were destroyed? I'll show you again different satellite imagery in higher resolution, showing yet again not a single plane within the airfield was destroyed. Now, the ones parroting this information or disinformation are simply shills or bots who cannot think for themselves. Therefore, they keep parroting the official information from either Ministry of Defense. And I'm just here to tell you the things I say I don't pull out of thin air. I actually research, I get evidence before announcing things. Sometimes I do make mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. It's part of being human. But the vast majority of the time, I go for exact evidence and proof that something has or hasn't happened before I mention it in my videos. Multiple times in recent weeks and months, the Ukrainians have increased the lies that they tell. They returned to saying 100% of Russian missiles and drones are shut down, despite that not happening. They claim attacking and destroying Russian ships without it happening, and satellite image coming out showing it didn't happen. And now the airfields saying it happened, it didn't happen. We saw the Belgorod and Kursk raids. We saw many things. Now they are resorting to counterattacking across the front, actually succeeding to launch these counterattacks and push Russians back. However, they are committing the vast majority of their forces to the front line. There are approximately 5 Ukrainian brigades currently being formed in the back, in the rear, But other than that, the vast majority of the Ukrainian forces are committed to the front line, pretty much evenly across the front to prevent Russian advances. However, them being so close to the front line makes them obvious targets for the Russian Air Force, which has significantly improved over the past couple of weeks and months. This has allowed them to inflict heavy casualties on the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians' casualties simply go up. And meanwhile, if you take a look at the Russian casualties according to Mediasona, looking at it semi-annually, it has only gone down since the start of the war. Second part of 2022 had almost 10,000 before it went up to almost around 13,000 in the first half of 2023, where the majority of these were Wagner and inmates, before moving on to 2023, the second part, which was from the summer offensive of the Ukrainians to the end of the 2023, which had a decrease to around 8,000 Russian fatalities. And finally, in the first months of 2024, we see that it is at the lowest point in the past half year. All of this shows that the Ukrainians are taking more casualties, the Russians are taking less, despite the heavy fighting over Avdiivka in the past 3 months in this RUAF. We see that the Russian casualties went back to the level before the offensive began, and this shows that the Russians have improved the tactics and strategies to decrease their own casualties. And despite the very slow advances the Russians are undergoing, it is clear that they have significantly improved their ability to grind down the Ukrainian army while keeping their own alive. And this is why we're getting articles from the West saying that the Russians have fully recovered. It's despite them expecting it to take place in a decade, it took place in just a year, and other things. All of this adds up to this war being sustainable for the Russians and not the Ukrainians, and this will eventually lead to a deteriorating situation for the Ukrainians and eventual collapse. I'm pretty much betting my whole career on this since I've been saying this for the past weeks, if not months. My first post about it was in December, so 4 months I've been saying the Ukrainians have no way out of this. There's no up point for them. It's going to completely, continuously go in a downwards direction. They may launch some counterattacks, they may retake some positions, but inevitably the current rate as things are going, the Russians will end in a complete victory over Ukraine. And that'll be all for this update. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe. Check out my Patreon for additional content, and have a great day.